What's going on, everyone? Hope you had a nice Thanksgiving, or if you don't celebrate Thanksgiving, hope you had a nice weekend. Long one here. My daughter was out of school Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then the weekend, Saturday, Sunday. So got some quality family time in there, which is awesome. But ready to get back into the groove. Might take me a little while though. The reason I'm able to record this video now is I was 4 hours early to a call. Looks like time changes are going to be a challenge today. Let's get right into it. We're talking general updates on the war in Ukraine, not a specific time period here, but we're roughly going to be looking at the last week or so, recording this on November 28th. I posted some pictures a few days ago from Bakhmut, and this is a part of the front that has looked like World War I for a while, with the trenches and kind of the no man's land looking area. And it's getting more and more like that by the day, it seems. It does look like they got some rain in parts of Ukraine, which is making these trenches even more unlivable. And I know it just kind of looks uncomfortable at a glance, but trench foot is actually something that can really have a negative impact on an army pretty quickly. So trench foot can set on in about 10 hours of a cold, damp environment, which these guys are living in day and night, and can happen even faster if they're not moving around. And moving around is a lot easier said than done when your feet hurt so much that even walking is a challenge. This is something I've never even been close to experiencing, but there are obviously a lot of cases written about and studied from World War I, and it's crazy. Even knowing that this is a problem, there's only so much you can do about it in these types of conditions. I mean, where is a soldier in this case going to go to where they can dry out their feet and put on dry socks and dry boots? It's not very realistic. Over time, trench foot leads to numbness and pain in the feet to where the soldier or whoever it's impacting can no longer walk. In the worst case scenarios, it can lead to gangrene, but even well before it reaches that point, a soldier that can't walk is pretty useless on the front. This is one of those things that's easy to critique from a distance, like why not just build the trenches better? Why not add more drainage? Or maybe only keep the trenches on high ground, right? There's all these perfect solutions. But who knows the circumstances that each one of these trenches were built, and they're often done hastily, sometimes under fire, and then improved over time. As bad as some of those pictures look right now, it's not crazy to think that when they were being built, the focus wasn't so much on what is this going to look like during the rainy season, and much more on the concern that Russian artillery is raining down day and night, and they needed to take cover. Long story short, the perfect trench isn't needed until it is. Continuing on with Bakhmut, there hasn't been much of a change in the positions over the last week or so, and according to Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, movement and clearance of the city isn't the actual goal, but turning that area into a meat grinder. In an interview, I'll link it in the description here, he said, quote, "Bakhmut is a large, well-fortified area with roads, suburbs, and water barriers. The Ukrainian army is well prepared and provides decent resistance. Our task is not Bakhmut itself, but the destruction of the Ukrainian army and the reduction of its combat potential, which has an extremely positive effect on other areas, which is why this operation was dubbed the Bakhmut meat grinder." That phrase always gives me chills when we're talking about war, meat grinder. I mean, there's an interesting, at least to me, an interesting part of war when it comes to strategy and force employment. Like, how can you outthink, outplan, out-execute your adversary to try to gain any sort of advantage? Usually, a component of that is how to minimize losses, at least on the friendly side. But a meat grinder, a place to just kill as many people as possible, it's terrifying. And history shows we as people are actually pretty good at that. I can't help but think of the brutal World War I battlefield where German General Falkenhayn is credited with the phrase, "They will bleed the French white" at Verdun, and they nearly did. During the next 10 months, over 160,000 Frenchmen and 140,000 Germans were killed in that one area alone. Now, outside of Bakhmut, there's been a slight increase in Russian offensive activity around Seversk, that's roughly 20 miles northeast of Bakhmut, and while this is hard to dial in exactly, it does seem like Russian shelling and airstrikes have picked up all across the front over the last couple weeks. Something to keep in mind is where the Russian troops that were withdrawn from Kherson just a couple weeks ago are going to be relocated. Without knowing exact force dispositions, it would have taken more troops to maintain that bridgehead they had across the Dnieper down in Kherson than it does to hold a defensive line on the eastern bank of the river. So even though they're still continuing to hold that line, there's likely some number of Russian troops that are freed up to go elsewhere. There are a few options as to where these troops might be sent. Now, Russia hasn't done a great job of rotating their frontline units throughout this war, but if they're looking long-term, or at least until spring, they very well might move some of these troops back to Russia to rest, refit, both in terms of equipment and personnel, and retrain before heading back to Ukraine sometime in the next few months. Of course, there's a possibility that they were shifted to an area with a new offensive set to kick off as soon as they're ready to go. And there are some reports that at least a handful of these troops out of Kherson have been moved to Bakhmut. We'll have to wait and see to confirm. But that's the kind of thing that really wears down soldiers. The emotional and physical toll of fighting can be absolutely draining, and I think it's easy to forget sometimes that these soldiers are people. They get burned out, and when that happens, they're nowhere near as effective as they could be. Now, while I do think Russia has been starting to view this conflict more long-term than they had originally, I imagine these troops are likely sent to reinforce some of their potential weak spots all along the line. The Ukrainian push in Kharkiv and the liberation of Kherson were not great moments for Russia, no matter how you spin it. In Kharkiv, the lines were thin and undermanned. In Kherson, the logistical effort to maintain that front likely became more of a burden than Surovikin wanted to tackle. And now that these two relatively weak points are exploited, I wouldn't be surprised if Russia focused on cementing their hold in other areas now that they have a little extra manpower to play with. Kind of in line with that, there were some pictures released over the last few weeks by both sides, really, of defensive positions being built in Russia, Ukraine, and Crimea. Trenches, bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, things like that. Overall, I'm inclined to say don't read too much into this. It's more likely that the two sides are taking the opportunity with a relative lull in the fighting to increase their defensive posture wherever they stand. Improving your position is something that any trained military would do whenever they're not actively on the move. So the longer Russia or Ukraine stays in any one of these positions, the more fortified it becomes. The positions in Belgorod, Russia are a little different. Haven't seen any signs that Ukraine is interested at all in crossing into Russian territory. But on the other hand, it's not crazy that Russia would want to fortify every section of their border with Ukraine. I mean, they are at war. And while it seems unlikely now, and I, again, don't think it's anywhere in the plans, it'd be hard for Russia to explain to their population why there was any lightly defended position along their border with Ukraine that at some point in the future could be exploited. All right, we can't ignore the missile and drone strikes that have continued all across Ukraine over the last few weeks. It does seem like each wave of attacks is having a greater and greater impact on Ukraine's infrastructure. I haven't really come across any accounts from Ukraine suggesting that this tactic is having any effect in terms of pushing Zelensky to the negotiating table, but we have to remember that there will be and is some sort of impact. I saw this picture the other day of a little Ukrainian girl who had to go to a nearby gas station to hook up her oxygen machine or whatever it is that helps her breathe because there's no electricity in her home. I mean, think of any storm here in the United States when power goes out even for a day or two in the middle of winter. There are always deaths that result from that. The same will happen in Ukraine. Every day they go without power or with limited power, it's likely that some elderly, sick, or young Ukrainians will die. I don't mean this in the sense that they should give up or give in, more just a reminder to all of us who are not in Ukraine that these infrastructure strikes are having a very real impact on a lot of people every single day, and it's more than just not having lights or not being able to use your phone. Shifting a little bit outside of Ukraine, I wanted to bring up what NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg said in a press conference on November 25th. Quote, "We are all paying a price for Russia's war against Ukraine, but the price we pay is in money, while the price Ukrainians pay is in blood. And if we let Putin win, all of us will pay a much higher price for many years to come. If Putin and other authoritarian leaders see that force is rewarded, they will use force again to achieve their goals. That would make our world more dangerous, and all of us more vulnerable. So it is in our security interest to support Ukraine. We need to remember what this war is about. Russia is the aggressor, Ukraine is the victim of aggression. And of course, Ukraine has a right to defend itself. We will help Ukraine uphold that right. There will be no lasting peace if the aggressor wins, if oppression and autocracy prevail over freedom and democracy. Most wars end with negotiations, so NATO will continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. We will not back down." How this war impacts all of us not in Ukraine is complicated. I got it. But I think Stoltenberg did a pretty good job of breaking it down into simple terms. Personal opinion, whether you support what we're doing in Ukraine or not, I think our leaders here in the United States could do a better job of explaining why we're taking the actions that we are. Finally, wanted to bring these two items up. They're sort of like gut feelings or even trends I've noticed over the last few weeks. I don't necessarily have an analysis to pull from either one of these, just wanted to point them out. The first is the Russian media has been showing a lot more like official videos of their troops training or even during operations in Ukraine. This was never at zero, like they've always been putting out content, but it seems like it's increased over the last few weeks, especially when it comes to showing training videos. These are clips of soldiers training either in Russia or some in Belarus. They look recent. These don't look like they're old clips being recycled for like propaganda purposes. Again, nothing out of the ordinary in terms of what they're showing here, just a definite increase in the volume. And the second item, again, something that just stood out to me over the last few weeks here, is there was a random push last week from Russia around the U.S. biolab theory in Ukraine. I'll post a link to the thread. It was on Telegram if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But anyways, I know this has been a talking point since the start of the war, but it really popped up more last week with quite a bit of content pushed behind it. Again, I don't have any sort of analysis or prediction as to what this might mean. Just seemed a little bit out of the ordinary. But that'll do it for now. We'll see y'all next time.